expected my darts video from last week to be received so positively. So thank you so much to everyone who watched the video, everyone who pushed the like button on that video, and if you haven't seen it, I'll have it linked down in the description. But in that first video, I sort of mentioned a little controversy, a bit of a scandalous era in the history of professional darts in the early 90s. So that's what this video is going to be about. And as usual, let's start with some background. So in 1973, this guy, Ollie Croft, he sort of headed the formation of the British Darts Organization. We'll refer to it as the BDO from now on. Now, there was already a governing body for darts in the UK. It was called the National Darts Association of Great Britain. But over the following years after 1973, the BDO sort of got bigger than the Darts Association. And by the early 80s, the BDO basically had a monopoly on organized darts in Britain. They organized the World Championship. They were a founding member of the World Darts Federation, the WDF. And remember that name for later. But the WDF is basically the global governing body for competitive darts. And to be fair to the BDO, they're credited with facilitating the rise of darts from, just a pub game to the sort of worldwide sport that it is today. Now, darts had actually appeared on television off and on for the last century or so. Actually, it first appeared on the BBC in 1937 when the BBC broadcast this darts competition that happened at Alexandra Palace, which you might know is actually where the World Championship happens these days. It's actually happening right now when this video goes up. But there was really a boom for televised darts in the 70s and the 80s. ITV started covering the World Masters in 1974, and not to be outdone, in 1975, the BBC started broadcasting the British Open. And then in 1978, the BBC picked up the first ever World Professional Darts Championship. Their reasoning was that the tournament was a cheap way to fill the schedules at a time of year and a time in history where soccer, football, the programming was often interrupted by weather. And so you could always sort of count on the darts to fall back on. So, the BBC didn't do it out of love for darts. And, I mentioned as a perfect example of this in the last video that 1983 final that played when soccer was just completely off the air one Saturday afternoon, and it ended up being watched by 8.3 million people, and it it was this epic match where Keith Deller, who was like a heavy underdog, ended up defeating Eric Bristow, like 6-5 in a really tight, exciting match. Meanwhile, ITV is like cross-promoting darts with this game show called Bullseye. And Bullseye at its peak had 20 million viewers, and virtually every recognizable darts player appeared on the show, so they became sort of household names. And in turn, with the sport growing, the athletes growing in popularity, the prize money got bigger, the sponsorships got bigger, the TV coverage got bigger. So that allowed many of, these top players to become full-time professional dart players. But what goes up must come down. And in the mid-80s, more and more tournaments were taken off the air. Ultimately, 1988 was like a big crash for televised darts. At the beginning of the year, there were still 14 tournaments being broadcast in a year on British television. But then the BBC decided to reduce its darts coverage to just one tournament, one competition per year, and ITV cancelled all of their darts coverage. So by the following year, by 1989, the only televised event that was left was the World Championship, then known as the Embassy World Championship. And that was sort of blamed on television executives who wanted to attract a younger audience and a more affluent audience. They associated darts with older people and lower income groups, and unfortunately those groups just don't attract advertisers. Companies want to attract or to advertise to young people with disposable income. But it wasn't just the TV executives. The BDO was also partially blamed. See, the common feeling amongst some of the pros was that the BDO didn't do enough, for one, to promote the sport, and also to improve its image. See, at the time, you were allowed to smoke on stage, you were allowed to drink on stage, and when that was picked up, it picked up just by culture in general, but especially by this one sketch comedy show that starred like Rowan Atkinson, and they did this sketch about it that basically some people said, affected the image so deeply of darts within the country. So they said, if the BDO is willing to take credit or responsibility for the success of darts, then they must accept the responsibility for its failure as well. And, Ollie Croft was willing to take responsibility for the success. So, in 1988, the BDO banned smoking on stage, and then shortly after, they banned alcohol on stage as well. But it actually had very little impact on the image of darts by this point. It was maybe too little, too late, that kind of thing. And more TV opportunities never really materialized. So now a lot of these players, they also had long-standing issues with the BDO beyond the TV coverage becoming, almost non-existent. And some of their grievances were that players had no say in how, tournaments were run. They lost money when they played international matches. They were not allowed to have personal sponsors on their shirts when they were playing in competitions, but they had to promote the BDO sponsors for free. Hello, UFC. And, they argued that they did not receive a fair share of the revenue, the money that was now coming in when the sport had sort of peaked. And so, while the BDO did excel at bringing in younger, newer amateur players, the pros argued that the BDO was ill-equipped to, properly support its top 32 best players. So, Ollie Croft, as I said, he credited his own organization for elevating the pros to where they were, but he never considered how the pros helped the BDO get the recognition that it had. He didn't want to acknowledge that it was a two-way street. He said that the BDO did not owe anyone a living. So, they held meetings to allow the players to air their concerns, but very little changed from those meetings. And so with darts popularity starting to go downhill, the prize money started to get smaller and smaller. The pros were being invited to fewer bookings for exhibition matches. So those players that had become full-time professionals during the boom a few years earlier, all of a sudden they were unable to make a living from darts, from playing. And the final straw, as it were, was after the 1992 World Championships. BDO and the BBC released this VHS tape with highlights from that year's final, in addition to highlights from the finals of 85, 87, 83, and 1990, I think, of the World Championship finals. But the players that appeared on the tape, they were not consulted in advance, and they were not offered any payment for, the use of their image in this VHS tape. The BDO, as you can probably predict by now, they argued that the players had signed over all their rights, and so the BDO was not obligated, and in fact the players were not entitled to any notice or any payment. So, in January of 1992, 16 professional players, including every previous BDO World Championship winner who was still active, they created their own darts organization, and they named it the World Darts Council, the WDC. And essentially, their goal in forming was to hire a PR consultant to improve the image of the game and to get more tournaments on television, which was supposed to be, part of the BDO's mandate. And actually that year in October, the WDC staged their first televised event. Now, the next January 1993, the 1993 World Championship comes around. And the WDC players, those 16 players, they wore the WDC insignia on their shirt sleeves while they were playing. Obviously, unsurprisingly, the BDO asked them to remove the insignia, the badge, from their shirt for the competition. And so the WDC players, they essentially decided that if they were not going to be recognized by the BDO, then they would no longer play in this World Championship, the Embassy World Championship. So, on January 7th, 1993, the World Championship isn't even over yet. The 16 WDC players, they release a statement saying that they would only participate in the 1994 Embassy World Championship, the next edition of the tournament, if it was organized by the WDC rather than the BDO. The statement also said that these 16 players would only recognize the WDC as having the authority to sanction their participation in darts tournaments worldwide. So if it wasn't approved, if it wasn't organized by a body that recognized the WDC, then those 16 players would be out. And on January 24th, 1993, so a couple of weeks after that statement came out and after the World Championships are over, the BDO responded by suspending those 16 players who they referred to as rebels, and moving forward, so will we, from all BDO tournaments in Great Britain. And some of the names that you might recognize from those 16 from the previous video include Phil Taylor, Rod Harrington, Eric Bristow, and Keith Deller. They were part of the rebels, the 16 rebels. So a couple months later, that wasn't enough for the BDO. They decide to turn the suspension of the rebels from, the original suspension, which was from playing in any tournament on British soil, to now be a full-scale ban of the WDC from being able to play in any BDO-sanctioned darts anywhere in the world. And to take it a step further, the BDO also passed a motion that said that any BDO players who participated in exhibition match or events with WDC players would also be banned from the BDO. We'll get into how restrictive that was in a moment, but let's fast forward to 1993, October of 1993, because in Las Vegas there is a World Darts Federation meeting. So not the WDC, the rebels, but that world governing body that the BDO was a founding member of. So at this meeting, the BDO sought to have their bans officially ratified on a world scale in the WDF rules. The United States and Canada were the only two countries that refused to sanction the ban. Even after the votes came in favor of, the ban, and they realized that they were the only two countries that were against it, they still maintained that they refused to sanction the ban. They said that they were being asked to do something that was against their country's constitutions, and so if they sort of accepted the sanctions, they would be breaking the law in their own countries, in Canada and in the United States. So the WDC actually took advantage of this by inviting seven American professional darts players to play in the upcoming 1994 WDC World Darts Championship. And the ban was never, ever enforced in America and Canada. One WDC player said that the Canadians didn't give a toss about the split, and, WDC players were allowed to play in the Canadian Open, for example. But despite the USA and Canada pushing back on the sanctions on the ban on the rebels was enforced rigorously everywhere else. So even pub teams were warned that they faced a ban from competitions if their pubs hosted exhibitions by the rebel players. It even went as far as, so Phil Taylor's cousin was also a darts player, and he was warned not to associate with his cousin Phil Taylor because he could be banned for that. One BDO official even tried to document members of the audience at a WDC exhibition event so that they could be banned from future BDO events. It was ridiculous. I mean, by their own rules, that BDO official should be banned from the BDO for being at the WDC event in the first place. I mean, come on. So, I mentioned the WDC World Darts Championship in 1994. So, since the rebels were banned from the Embassy World Championship, they decided to stage their own worlds. And, with the emergence of satellite television around the same time, they now had another option for a broadcaster beyond ITV or the BBC, and that was Sky Sports. Sky Sports actually had recently bought the television rights for the Premier League that had recently formed. So they were definitely interested in, putting their own little stamp on the world of sports broadcasting. So in 1993, Sky and the WDC announced an exclusive deal to broadcast the WDC World Championship, which would be held in December of 1993 at the Circus Tavern. But it wasn't going to be all smooth sailing for the rebels. Chris Johns, who was one of the 16, he decided to return to the BDO sort of mid-year. And then in November of 1993, just weeks before the WDC World Championship, Mike Gregory also returned to the BDO from the WDC. There were rumors that he was pressured by Ollie Croft, who basically told him, you could lose your house if this WDC thing doesn't work out. Ironically, though, it was really Mike Gregory leaving that threatened the WDC's existence more than anything, because that contract with Sky Sports stipulated that all the WDC players were going to participate in the World Championship. So, without Mike Gregory at the last minute, the deal could have fallen through and he would have been safe at the BDO, but the 14 remaining rebels would have been affected by him. Thankfully, for the future of the sport, Sky honored the deal on the condition that no other players would withdraw from the tournament. So the remaining 14 players hung on, and the 1994 WDC World Championship went ahead. Besides the remaining original 14 rebels, there were 2 more English players, 1 Irishman, and those 7 American players that I mentioned earlier. Meanwhile, in the background, the WDC is suing the BDO for lost earnings and restraint of trade. They argued that the BDO had a monopoly on darts events, and they even argued that the ban violated European Union law. So the case was due to go to High Court, but so much money had been sunk into this case by both sides that in June of 1997, the BDO and the WDC reached an agreement in civil court. And the summary of this agreement is basically that the BDO lost the case. The judge agreed that the WDC players had been unreasonably restricted from carrying out their profession, and they agreed that all players should be free to participate in tournaments and exhibitions. But this was an agreement after all. So in return, the WDC dropped their damages claim for loss of earnings, and they agreed to remove the word world from their name. So the WDC renamed themselves to the Professional Darts Corporation, the PDC, and then the PDC recognized the WDF, the World Darts Federation, as the governing body of darts worldwide, and they also recognized the BDO as the governing body for darts in the UK. After all this went down, Ollie Croft said that he was not disappointed by the result. He confirmed that there would continue to be 2 world championships, one run by the BDO and one run by the PDC. But he said, our champion will be champion of 500,000 players throughout the world. Theirs will be champion of 20 odd. So he's clearly still salty, even though he says he's not disappointed. But that was the setup. that was the setup that they were in for the double world championship, because no player could compete in both versions of the world championship in the same season. And players who reached the top 16, the final 16 players in one year's world championship were not allowed to play for the rival championship the next year. They were contractually obligated to play in the same tournament the following year. All that being said, those 20-odd players that the PDC had were many of the greatest players of all time, or at least of the time. Whereas the BDO's strength was in, first of all, a larger pool of players. They also ran women's and amateur events, and that their world championship was older and more established. And it was still shown on the BBC. Remember, they had that long-running partnership with the BBC. So it could reach a wider audience than the, Sky televised PDC event. But if history teaches us anything, it's that one side will come out on top. So, in 2001, Barry Hearn became the chairman of the PDC, and we talked about him in the other video, but under Hearn's management, the PDC Pro Tour was established, and quite a few major televised tournaments were added to the circuit. The total prize money for the PDC increased from £500,000 per year in 2001 to over £10 million per year in 2021. In 2002, the PDC World Championship actually overtook the BDO event as the richest darts tournament in the world. So even though the BDO had, the BBC and the bigger pool of players, the PDC was making all the money. By 2015, the PDC's World Championship prize fund was £1.25 million compared to the BDO's World Championship total prize fund of £339,000. And that's when, 2015 is when a large number of the BDO's top players moved over to the PDC. The money was obviously a big pull for them, but so was Phil Taylor. Phil Taylor was with the PDC, and people wanted to play against the GOAT. They wanted to win against the GOAT and have that sort of bragging right. So by 2015, the BDO was described as mostly an unwilling feeder for the PDC. In 2016, the BBC ended its coverage of the BDO World Championship, and instead they replaced it with a new PDC tournament, the Champions League of Darts. And then moving ahead again, the 2019 World Masters, which was a BDO event, it was basically a farce. That is another topic for another video. But after that event, the World Darts Federation, the WDF, that had sort of, protected the the BDO just 20 or 30 years earlier, they announced that the BDO was demoted to the status of associate member, and that the WDF would no longer recognize BDO organized tournaments. So, in September of 2020, the company BDO went into liquidation. And this is despite the PDC trying to buy the BDO. Ollie Croft just would not have it. He'd rather see the BDO burn than for it to be owned by the PDC. And so the BDO sold all 38 of its trophies and plaques in order to pay off creditors who were being affected by the liquidation, and that was the end of the BDO. And also, that is how the entire split in darts sort of saga came to an end. The BDO, who had taken over, in the 70s and the 80s from the Darts Association, hoisted by their own Ollie Croft, and eventually lost out to the PDC, which had different morals, who were, player first kind of organization. And let that be a lesson to us all about being nice to people. But with that, guys, I'm gonna let you go for now. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.